let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
As John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in 1961, he inherited an all-or-nothing defense policy. It provided only two military options for dealing with the Soviet threat: do nothing and let the diplomats work it out, or launch an all-out nuclear attack against the communist bloc. Humiliation or Holocaust? President Kennedy demanded more options, a middle ground. A new defense policy emerged known as flexible response. It called for a massive buildup in conventional forces, as well as new tactical and strategic nuclear arms. It also emphasized counterinsurgency and other unconventional military operations for dealing with threats in the Third World. With this diverse arsenal, the president and his advisors believed it would be possible to fight a limited war with the Soviets, even a limited nuclear war, without igniting a world-ending apocalypse. This premise was tested by the major Cold War crises of the early 1960s. Kennedy encountered his first international challenge after just 3 months in office. Just 90 miles from the beaches of Florida, a military dictator had seized power in Cuba. Fidel Castro promised his people,
"Not communism or Marxism, but representative democracy, social justice, and a well-planned economy."
But U.S. leaders feared the worst. Castro looked like a communist and talked like a communist. He was a liability. In April 1961, plans were set in motion for an armed invasion of Cuba. The covert mission took its name from the main landing ground on the Bay of Pigs. The CIA had armed and trained a band of Cuban exiles for the covert operation. President Kennedy approved the plan, but then he crippled the operation by refusing air and naval support. The invasion force was crushed. The Kennedy administration humiliated. Attorney General Robert Kennedy feared that the Soviet Union would seize on the Bay of Pigs as a sign of weakness. He warned his brother, "If we don't want Russia to set up missile bases in Cuba, we had better decide now what we are willing to do to stop it." Following the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Cuba. Castro appealed to the Soviet Union for aid. For Khrushchev, it was a coup. A communist outpost in America's own backyard. What could be better? Khrushchev's elation sprouted into a germ of an idea. What if we threw a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants? While Khrushchev's scheme took root in the Caribbean, the two Cold War superpowers faced off over the increasingly contentious issue of Berlin. By the 1960s, West Berlin was a thriving cosmopolitan city. In the words of one Cold War historian, the West German capital was a permanent advertisement for the virtues of capitalism and democracy in the middle of communist East Germany. Still, West Berliners lived with the fear that the communists could cut off land access to their city, as they had done during the Berlin blockade in 1948. Jobs, prosperity, and freedom, and the security afforded by the American military presence beckoned to the hungry, disenfranchised, and repressed of East Germany. To the exasperation of their communist leaders, millions fled across the open border. By the time President Kennedy met Nikita Khrushchev in 1961, millions of East Germany's best and brightest had left the country, and the mass exodus had become a crisis for the communists.
Marxism was born in Germany. If it does not prove itself as superior and vital here, then we have not won.
Tired of haggling over the divided city, Khrushchev issued an ultimatum to the American president: withdraw U.S. troops currently occupying West Berlin or face a blockade. Kennedy stood his ground.
We will at all times be ready to talk, if talk will help. But we must also be ready to resist with force, if force is used upon us. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
War did not come to Berlin, but a wall did. Barbed wire and concrete 12 feet high and 100 miles long, isolating West Berlin. East German border patrols had orders to shoot to kill, and they did. The wall was a hateful thing, Khrushchev admitted, but what should I have done? The East German economy would have collapsed. The much-hated Berlin Wall finally settled the nagging German question and averted war in Europe. But events elsewhere threatened to push the world to the brink of destruction. In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev's hedgehog triggered the gravest confrontation of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet ships crossed the Atlantic bound for Cuba. They carried military hardware, Soviet troops, and nuclear missiles capable of striking nearly anywhere in the United States. On October 14th, U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba confirmed what for months had been rumored.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons to be turned back.
For Americans, the idea of going to war with the Soviet Union was terrifying, but having nuclear missiles stationed permanently in Cuba was unthinkable.
I'd hate like heck to see us go to war, but if it's necessary to prevent a nuclear war, I think the action has to be taken at this time.
Well, I think it's high time we stopped Russia from having things her own way.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson confronted his Soviet counterpart.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The crisis turned critical. U.S. military forces prepared for a possible invasion of Cuba. It was the greatest emergency troop mobilization since World War II. For the first time in its history, the nation's nuclear army, the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, moved to Defense Condition 2. The next step, DEFCON 1, would mean nuclear war. If a nuclear strike was launched from Cuba, American Minuteman missiles were poised to destroy every major city in the Soviet Union.
Re-entry, arming and fusing.
Just as the flexible response had promised, the president had every military option at his disposal.
Warhead, arming and fusing. Channel 7.
As tension mounted, the first opening in the crisis came from Khrushchev. On October 26th, he cabled the president.
Mr. Kennedy, you and I are like two men pulling on a rope with a knot in the middle. The harder we pull, the tighter the knot, until even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. Let us relax forces, take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this.
As the two leaders fumbled to untie the knot, events they had unleashed threatened to overwhelm them. Castro pleaded with Khrushchev to launch a preemptive nuclear strike should the U.S. mount an invasion. In Washington, Kennedy was pressed to attack Cuba. Air Force General Curtis LeMay insisted American military forces should surround the island and, if need be, fry it. While the world edged closer to the nuclear abyss, Bobby Kennedy met secretly with the Soviet ambassador in Washington to seek a negotiated settlement. In the end, diplomacy prevailed. On October 28th, a message was broadcast from Moscow. Khrushchev had agreed to remove the missiles. The world breathed a sigh of relief.
The following is the text of President Kennedy's statement of noon. I welcome Chairman Khrushchev's statesmanlike decision to stop building bases in Cuba, dismantling offensive weapons, returning them to the Soviet Union under UN verification. This is an important and constructive contribution to peace.
In exchange for the removal of Cuban missiles, President Kennedy pledged that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Privately, he also agreed to remove American missiles stationed in Turkey and targeting the Soviet Union. The missile crisis caused the president to reconsider his assumption that a nuclear war was winnable. He now understood that destroying the Soviet Union would mean sacrificing the United States to the same fate. This premise became the basis of a new Kennedy defense strategy: mutual assured destruction, MAD. The idea was that if no one stood a chance of surviving a nuclear war, no one would start one. Kennedy and Khrushchev tried to rein in the spiraling arms race following the Cuban Missile Crisis. Neither side was prepared to eliminate nuclear weapons, but during the 1960s, accords were reached on how to manage them. The first agreement was signed in 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. It was a small step, but laid the groundwork for a more productive relationship between the two leaders. It was not to be. 1 month after the Test Ban Treaty was signed in Moscow, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The official government investigation concluded that a lone gunman was responsible. Lee Harvey Oswald, an American communist with ties to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Was Oswald part of a conspiracy to assassinate the president? If he was, he took the secret to his grave. 2 days after the assassination, Oswald himself was gunned down. Just 4 months later, Khrushchev was deposed as head of the Soviet Union. The charges? He had allowed his own cult of personality to develop and no longer listened to advisors. He had ruined Soviet agriculture, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and allowed the Berlin Wall to be constructed, a monument to the failures of communism. In short, Khrushchev's accusers said, he had humiliated the Soviet Union. Still, no blood was shed in this Russian Revolution. Khrushchev saw that as true progress.
Could anyone have dreamed of telling Stalin that he didn't suit us anymore and suggesting he retire? Not even a wet spot would have remained where we had been standing. Now, everything is different. The fear is gone. That's my contribution.
The end of the Kennedy-Khrushchev era ushered in a period of unprecedented social upheaval. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were challenged by those within their own societies. America witnessed the struggle for civil rights and racial equality, political assassinations, and the youth counterculture of the 1960s. The Vietnam War divided American society. A growing credibility gap highlighted the contradictions between the statements of political leaders and the facts on the ground. By 1968, it seemed like the nation had come unraveled. That same year, the Soviet Union, now under Leonid Brezhnev, struggled to reassert its influence after the modest tolerance of the Khrushchev years. In Czechoslovakia, a communist reformer named Alexander Dubček sought to put a new face on socialism through his Prague Spring political reforms, only to see his dreams snuffed out by Soviet-led forces of the Warsaw Pact. In justifying the attack, Brezhnev outlined the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, in which he claimed the right to violate the sovereignty of any country that turned away from communism. The Soviets had Czechoslovakia, the United States had Vietnam, and both countries had nuclear missiles pointed at the other. The world had grown weary of the Cold War, and pressure was building for change.